My name is Christopher Gruner. I'm the secretary for the Boston 9/11 Truth Organization. We are co-sponsors with the International Center for 9/11 Justice of the program this evening. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that from the organization's director, Ted Walter. In a moment, I will bring Ted to the stage, but first, funny story. Years ago, my wife, then my girlfriend, and Ted's parents, then hanging out together, we all lived together in a house in Berkeley, California, long before Ted was even thought of. And we went our separate ways after we all graduated and went into our professional lives. But Constance and I kept contact with what became Ted's parents. And every once in a while we'd be in touch. Still? Okay, good. And on one occasion, I remember we went and visited them in the Midwest, and I recall little Teddy chasing his sister around. And as the years went on, Ted's family moved to Mozambique, and we stayed in touch somewhat. But I must tell you the shock and delight that I had when Ted Walter burst upon the scenes as first an activist and then a leader in the movement for 9/11 Truth. It just left me feeling like, it's not just us old folks. It's not just our generation. There's a whole new generation coming up behind us. And I'm so encouraged by the work that Ted and his allies and colleagues are doing. As I say, many of you know Ted currently as the Executive Director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. But you may not know that Ted has a long history of 9/11 Truth activism. Ted moved to New York City and was a student at NYU, settling in there 2 weeks before the 9/11 attacks. So he was he was right at ground zero when it occurred. And like many of us, had this feeling like, well, the story we're getting about what happens that doesn't feel quite right. But Ted went on to explore and investigate, and by 2006, he had solidified into an activist for the pursuit of 9/11 Truth, because he, like so many of you, had figured out that we had been lied to in a very, very fundamental way. Ted served as the canvas director for the NYC 9/11 ballot initiative, which, although it gathered more than enough signatures, somehow didn't get on the ballot. He took a break from 9/11 activism to pursue his master's degree in public policy at the UC Berkeley, but then came back into the pursuit in an active way of 9/11 Truth as part of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth team, where he served as the Director of Strategy and Development for 8 years. He has authored a number of critically important papers. My favorite is Beyond Misinformation. If you haven't seen it, it's a great one to read. It gives so much information in such a very concise and clear way, and it's a wonderful pamphlet to hand out to people who you want to help open their minds about this subject. Ted joined with founders of the International Center for 9/11 Studies, the Journal of 9/11, the 9/11 Consensus Panel, the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and the original International Center for 9/11 Studies, all of which consolidated to become now the International Center for 9/11 Justice, of which Ted serves as the director. He is passionate about his work, as you're going to see in the film that he has directed and produced that we're going to show you this evening. On that note, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Ted Walter. Let's all give him a big hand.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. Wow, thanks. It was really wonderful to, hear the story before I existed, of you guys and my parents together. Yeah, wow. I just want to say, I'm just going to say a few words and let the film sort of speak for itself. But I just want to thank many people who are responsible for putting this evening together and also the film. So first of all, I want to thank Boston 9/11 Truth, for putting this on, for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun to work with you guys and have those weekly meetings planning this out. It's been great, so thank you. I'd like to also thank Hummux for doing the filming. Thank you very much for this Q&A that's going to happen afterwards. I also want to thank Marty Schotz and Ed Curtin, wherever you are, for making the trip from Western Massachusetts to do this Q&A after the film. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I suspect many of you have watched the film online, but nothing compares to watching a film with a room full of people, and then even more so having the opportunity to talk about it afterwards. So thank you all for being here and enhancing each other's experience, and I'm really honored to be able to watch the film with you. I haven't watched it in about 5 or 6 months, so I'm also excited. I also need to thank Graham McQueen, my dear friend, a friend of many of ours in this room. I worked with him from the early 2010s until a year ago when he passed away. The journey of this film started in the summer of 2022 when Graham told me that his doctors told him that he had only months left to live. He had been managing cancer for a few years prior to that. I had wanted to interview Graham. I had been wanting to interview him for a few years. And so I said, can we please do an interview in the next few months, a long interview, and try to make a film out of it. And he thought about it for a few days, and then realized it would be exhausting exertion of energy, but he agreed to do it. And the film wouldn't have, not only because he's the star of the film, but from the point that we decided to do it, he's really the one who he wrote a letter to his friends seeking funds so that we could actually hire a crew to film it professionally. He got really excited about it. The energy that he put forth during the interview was about eight or 9 hours on the stage of a movie theater in Hamilton, Ontario. It was hard for him, but as you'll see, he pulled through and left us with a very important message. I also want to thank one of his good friends who ended up contributing quite a bit to the making of the film when he wrote that letter, Marilyn Langlois. And she is now on the board of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And the film would not have happened without her. Lastly, I want to thank a gentleman named Richard Heap, who ended up editing and then eventually becoming the co-director of this film. If it were not for him, one thing I want to say about him is he's actually the brother-in-law of a 9/11 family member named Matt Campbell, who is currently campaigning to get a new investigation into the death of his brother in the UK in the form of what's called an inquest. And so he is right now in a battle with the authorities in the UK, the Attorney General for England and Wales, to try to get his brother's inquest reopened. But his brother-in-law is the person who edited this film and who co-directed it with me. And I think if it wasn't for his personal connection to the issue and his love and respect for Matt, I think this film would not have ended up being what it is. And it wouldn't have gotten made. He just kind of fell into our lap. So with that, I hope you enjoy the film, and I look forward to discussing with you afterwards. Thanks.
Now we have, oh dear, I've left my little paper behind. So I'm not going to be able to do good introductions of our two speakers, and I think Ted will do a much better job than myself.
Oh, I think you know Marty and Ed better than I do. Maybe they would like to introduce themselves. Yeah, so I'll hand it over.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Marty Schotz, and I think I was invited to be on this panel primarily because of work I've done over the years on the JFK President Kennedy's assassination. And as the film indicated, there are connections. Before I say anything about that, I just want to say that I think this is an incredible film, Ted, really. And something you said at the beginning, I want to confirm. This is the third time I'm seeing this film, but the first time I'm seeing it in a theater. And it is much, much more impressive in a theater than when you watch it on your computer. I don't know whether you're in a familiar room and there's a lot of distractions, but when you're in a theater watching this film, it is much, much more impressive. So to whatever degree it can be shown in that form, I think it's important to do it, and I encourage everyone who has any possibility of having it shown in that way to do that. I think it, well, okay, I will now I'll just say a few things about my work with regard to the JFK assassination. I have, for many years, worked on the assassination and wrote a book which pulled together a lot of evidence indicating that, without any doubt, President Kennedy was killed in a plot organized by the CIA. But over the years, how Kennedy was killed and who killed him never seemed to be significant in terms of our public. What the part of the problem is not only the nature of the conspiracy, but the cover-up by all the various institutions within our society, mass media, universities. No one is really willing to talk about the absurdity of the government report on how President Kennedy died. And so eventually, I went in a different direction, and that was focusing on President Kennedy's American University speech, which you allude to in your film, because that speech outlines the peace process in detail and in real political terms like nothing else that I'm aware of. And one of the things I would say is that I view peace as a process. It is not a process separate from war as a process. Well, let's say this. The peace process goes on at the same time that the war process goes on. Peace process goes on in opposition to the war process. And I think it's extremely important for the public to understand what the true peace, international peace process is. And so that's why I think that President Kennedy's speech is so important. If we're going to have a successful effort to gradually end war. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Marty. And again, I would like to say what Marty said, that the film is extraordinary, and Ted is to be commended many times over. I've seen it numerous times, and each time I've seen it, I get very emotional, primarily because of Graham's death last year, and how he talks about how he had a vocation as a peacemaker, and he felt that he fulfilled that vocation. And as you probably all know, a vocation has a spiritual dimension to it. It is a calling, and who called Graham, I'll leave it up to you. But I would say he was a God-inspired man, speaking for myself. And why I'm here? Well, I'm a writer, a sociologist, a former professor, a friend of Graham's. and a long time writer about the assassinations of the 1960s and the events of what I call September 11th, 2001. I should say that I don't speak about 9/11 anymore because I believe that appellation, 9/11, is a bit of propaganda that was placed in our minds right from the start. And I won't go into the details, but I've written about it, and you know that when you dial 911, it's an emergency, and we've been in permanent emergency since September 11th, 2001, which is exactly what the authorities, that's where they want us to be. Graham talks a lot about war as a system and so forth, and I would like to say that the war, the primary war that makes war an effective system is the mass media's and the government's war on the American population. And this is true throughout the world. It is a media war, it is a propaganda war. And all war is concerned with propaganda. And, you know, I could go on and on talking about Graham's article at radical.com, his ebook, in which Graham wrote about the parallels between the assassination of President Kennedy and the events of September 11th, 2001. And he makes it very clear. I really urge you, go to radical.org, read this article, which is profound. He draws on a friend of Marty's and mine, Vince Salandria, the great early JFK researcher, an attorney from Philadelphia, a brilliant man. And his analysis of the JFK assassination. And Graham points out how you can take, and he uses only 2 examples, the same analysis, the authorities' response to the events, to show how fraudulent they both are. And he knew that the assassination of President Kennedy was directly linked to the events of September 11th, 2001, and that they were both executed by forces within the United States government. And I guess I better stop. I could get very wordy.
And yes, and it's a very connective piece that Graham saw things in whole cloth. He understood how there were certain types of systems that were consistent within themselves and could be seen in replica form. So I believe that is the first article of the second section. It was a great honor to work with him.
So JFK in his speech says this business of the U.S. trying to dominate the world doesn't make sense. We need to live at peace with other nations in the world and allow them to develop also, and so on. That was anathema to the leaders in the United States who wanted the United States to become and to remain this hegemonic power. And as we know, the PNAC, Project for a New American Century, in their 2000 document, and Zygmunt Brzezinski in his Grand Chessboard in 1997, both said that the economic integration of the Eurasian continent, which we are witnessing today, and has already turned the world from a unipolar world led by the US into a multipolar world. These people in these documents said that it's inevitable, but we can get one last American century, this one, if we have They both said this in their respective documents. This will not happen unless we have a new Pearl Harbor. We have to have somebody attack America, kill a few thousand people, just like we goaded the Japanese into doing in Pearl Harbor, or this will never happen. We will never get Americans willing to go fight and die in Asia, in Central Asia, and in the Middle East for another 40 or 50 years without a new Pearl Harbor. That's what 9/11 was. It was a continuation by the same interest groups who assassinated President Kennedy in 1963, and for the same reason, to try and extend this period of United States dominance in the world. And they're still trying to do it today, even though they've already failed. I was curious what your reaction was to that analysis.
I think it's spot on. I'm not sure there's a whole lot more that I can add to it. Yeah, I guess I would open it up. We're questions. Yes, Jill.
Questions on the stage right here.
Okay.
Amy? Oh, I'm sorry. Amy, she's going first.
So, first of all, thank you. That was amazing. And it was really beautiful to see Graham's connection to spirit and understanding that war is an entity. I mean, that was unbelievable. My concern is that as I look around the room, we're an older bunch. Mind, like there's a couple of you guys sprinkled in here.
Gee, you look like a youngster.
Yeah, exactly, and I shouldn't be in this room. Like, I'm usually, anyway. And I'm extremely concerned that the younger generation, the next generation is saying, they're saying, yeah, we know something was wrong with 9/11, but it's kind of already passed. So how do we get this to the next generation? And it's really something that we really need to put our heads around, because I think this is such an important puzzle piece to everything that's going on.
One more question, and then you guys can take a crack at both of them.
Should we? Okay.
Amy?
Great question. I mean, we could take a shot at it.
Okay.
Well.
It's going to be a different question. I would love to hear your answer before we ask a different
Okay,
question.
Okay. Well, I don't think there's one answer. I think there's probably a lot of different answers, and it's a tapestry of answers. One, and this is not the most captivating answer, but I honestly, I think one thing is to actually keep developing evidence related to 9/11. I think there's a lot still that we don't know, and that's one of the things that my organization is dedicated to. And I think there's sort of been a lull in new discoveries to a large extent. I think the controlled demolition evidence has been very well developed. I think the idea that the buildings were brought down by demolition it's out there, it's established. And I think there's other areas that are much less developed and much less resolved within the 9/11 research community. And I think if we can start to generate some breakthroughs on those fronts, I think that's one way that a younger generation might suddenly kind of be drawn to it, is by hearing these new discoveries. It's just one answer, but I think that's one important piece of it, is that we have to keep doing research. As Graham said, we need to keep exposing it, studying it, and so yeah, that's in particular the aviation aspects of what happened that day. What happened in the skies is not well understood in my view. So, but I think there's it also has a lot to do with storytelling, how we present this story. One of the things that it's hard because there has to be a lot of focus on the evidence, but in a way, this story is sometimes we fail to present it in like sort of the dramatic way that it actually could be presented. And we feel like we need to tiptoe around who did it, we need to tiptoe around all sorts of aspects of it. And I think we actually have a very compelling story with lots of good and evil, and the story is not finished yet. And so I think we need to, I think one thing that I try to do with this film is to present the big picture. And I think we need to be less afraid of sort of pointing fingers, less afraid of being labeled as conspiracy theorists in the sense that, like, oh, we don't have enough evidence to say yet who did it or how such and such happened. So something about telling the story frankly and the big picture and the good versus evil of it, I think would help too. But that's my attempt. Ed, Marty?
Well, we have a couple of young people in the audience, one of whom I know, and I suspect that they might have a better answer to the question of reaching young people. So I would sort of ask them to reply at some point.
Before you do, I would like to say this. In 2005, I taught a college course on 9/11, if you will, and the response among young college students was enormous. They did all this research. They read books this height, 5 or 6 volumes, including the 9/11 Commission report. And what I tried to do over the years as a professor was to link the study of 9/11 with the study of propaganda and the murder of President Kennedy as a whole. And not just President Kennedy. We can talk about the assassination of Malcolm X or Dr. Martin Luther King or Bobby Kennedy Sr., Senator Robert Kennedy, but to link them all together. And you probably all realize that after Kennedy was killed, the war in Vietnam just was escalated beyond belief, even though Kennedy said he was pulling U.S. troops out. They weren't even troops, advisors out of Vietnam, 1,000 by the end of 1963, and all the rest by the end of the following year. Johnson took over, the war went insane. He pushed it. It went on until 1974. 9/11 happens, the same thing happens. There are parallels. And I wanted to say one other thing. The hit movie of the summer of 2001 was what? Does anyone remember?
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor. Oh, how interesting. But it wasn't supposed to be in the theaters until December, the anniversary of the attacks of Pearl Harbor. But they pushed it up to May, Memorial Day weekend. Oh, it's perfect. And then you have this really bad movie, terrible film, but it's in the news every day. The new movie, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor. And as Ted shows in the film, and Graham talks about, what is this Pearl Harbor thing? Well, it's out there to get into your mind. It's propaganda, pure and simple.
Amar, did you want to take a crack at how young people could get more involved?
Mike?
This is one more answer to the question, and then yeah,
Okay.
I'd love to hear your question.
Could you give Amar the mic, and then it'll go back to you?
Thanks. I agree with Ted, and I agree with Ed about keep on investigating and exploring new fronts and doing good storytelling. And I agree with Ed about connecting it to the assassinations. And also, I would just add connecting it to current day issue. Like we talk about Project for New American Century, and the current war in Ukraine going on with the U.S. and Russia, the Western Russia, and there's a lot of interest in that. And then also what's going on in Gaza and Israel and the Middle East, and you see a lot of young people engaged right now with that issue on college campuses. So if you can continue meeting people where they're at and then drawing these connections, I think young people are actually very receptive. I agree with what you were saying about that there's a lot of young people who are very skeptical about the official story. So I think that they are receptive to this message, and especially if we meet them where they're at and focused on what's happening right now with the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza.
Go ahead, Amy.
Is this thing working? Well, I think we have to look at the big picture, and I thought the film was excellent. And at the very end, there were some shots of the UN and so on. And I'm thinking that right now, we've seen the great weakness of the UN, and it's really very sad that, and very disappointing that Gaza has gone on for 6 months now with massive starvation and killing children and, all these terrible atrocities going on, which should have been stopped after one day of bombing. If we had an effective UN, and I think what we have to think about is how can we make our UN more effective and take away the veto power that the U.S. has used and put some teeth into the international courts. So when they say genocide's going on, we can do something about it and stop it right away. And so I think that's something we really have to think about. How can we build a successful international institution to provide peace for all of us that we want?
You guys want to respond to that?
Well, I would only say that I think the UN reflects the problem that exists in the world internationally, and that is the conflict between the U.S. drive for hegemony and the desire of other states that are not aligned with the U.S. for a multipolar world. And that conflict is, to me, the leading conflict, and that if there can be movement toward a multipolar world, then the UN can be more effective. So somehow the U.S. drive for hegemony is the major obstacle that has to be defeated.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have more to say on it.
I just wanted to say that I think we can have a lot to learn from the young people. And I think they're way ahead of us in some respects. And the massive protests that are going on in universities throughout the country have really, in my opinion, exposed the root of the problem. And the fact that, we see now that we have non-representatives in that cabal down in D.C. who are not the least bit afraid to talk about annihilating people in Gaza, and they're pushing forward bills to prohibit us from being critical of this genocidal regime.
Yes, indeed.
I'd like to circle back to the young people. I've been with Boston 9/11 Truth since 2006, handing out literature on the streets. And I have to say that of all the people I come across, I was standing next to a middle school in Newton, and the kids were coming across the bridge. And I've never seen the level of interest among anybody. Like, they took everything we had, all our literature, our DVDs, and they were so interested. It made me feel like I was born again, and I really felt good about it. So
That's great.
that's all I say.
Yes.
I don't really have a question, but is it okay if I respond to the young generation question?
Sure.
I think, as the professor and several other people already pointed out, the younger generation is a lot more receptive and more suspicious of the official narrative. And I think the way to reach younger audience is to use the new tool we have, the mass media, not the traditional media for TV or but moving into social media, the age of social media. So we definitely have greater platform, reaching a wider audience, and using more flexible tactics. For example, spreading to a wider audience, like tonight there's a screening, so on and so forth. We have a panel, we have speakers, using Twitter, using Facebook, using Instagram, using all of these new tools. We will be able to reach a younger audience, and we definitely will be able to attract the younger generation to come into these events. Thank you.
know if this is more of a comment, but I'd just like to say I think Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the prime architects of 9/11 and planners, and that's the connection to current events. So that's my comment.
Well, the older generation, excluding people who are on the internet, which is only a small portion of people our age, believes everything the New York Times, BBC, NBC, PBS tells them. And New York Times uses all kinds of tricks. Israelis are slaughtered and murdered. The Palestinians are just dying. And there's just so many words like that, so many. And then the BBC, they obviously were in on 9/11 because they predicted building 7 going down way in advance. So I think we just have to accept that the older generation is never going to listen to us. They're going to always sit in front of the TV every night and be programmed. And unless we can get radically change the ownership of mainstream media, which I sincerely doubt, we can only deal with the young people.
One more point. Ted asked about the article that Graham wrote. It's called JFK 55 Years On, Casting Light on the JFK Assassination, as well as 9/11 and other 21st century crimes. It was written on 22nd of November 2018. And this brings to mind to me something that's very difficult for so many people to hold in their mind, the level of evil. My dear friend John Judge, who grew up around D.C., he was a first-generation assassination researcher of the 60s, and both of his parents worked as civilians in the Pentagon. His mother, 5 levels above top security. She was the primary manpower analyst for the deputy director of, I forget what it was called, but something to do with getting new people into the military. On Monday, November 25th, 1963, 3 days after President Kennedy was assassinated, she was given new orders from her superior to project a war in Vietnam that would last 10 years and cost 50,000 American troops. And she went back to the Joint Chiefs and she said, there must be some mistake. These numbers can't be right. And she was told, those are the numbers and that's what you'll use. She told John this after she had retired in the 70s. And what it is clear from that, it's very hard for people to believe. My country officials in my government wouldn't lie. They wouldn't dissemble. They wouldn't spout falsehoods. They wouldn't effect cover-ups, especially of, say, the leader who, all over the world, John F. Kennedy Way or whatever is named for that man, because of the kind of passion and connection he instilled on people, because he actually fought in a war and realized war could never be again. So in that way, the kind of thing of breaking through that veneer of the propaganda, as Ed says, is so essential to somehow speak the unspeakable, like Jim Douglas wrote about in JFK and the Unspeakable, why he died and why it matters, and to see how the elements that were murderous in post-World War II history. I saw the movie Gandhi after it came out, and I thought, God, how different the world is from the time he was murdered in 48 to the time Kennedy was murdered in 63. A sea change in the world that now you are actually having the intelligence apparatus, not just the civilian intelligence. John always talked about the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, inside of the Pentagon. There was hundreds of books written about the CIA. He would always say, how many books do you know that are written about the Defense Intelligence Agency? Very, very few.
Quick commercial. If you are not on our mailing list, Boston911truth.org, go there when you get home tonight, and that'll help us all to stay in touch better.
And IC911.org.
Yes, thank you. Please say that again.
And IC911.org.
Everybody get that?
IC.
Shout it from the rooftop.
IC911.org.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to, well, first I wanted to ask, how long has the Boston 9/11 Truth Group been around?
Since 2006.
Since 2006. And when will we have another gathering like this?
Good question. Every other week. Boston 9/11 Truth out of our email list. We have meetings by Zoom.
Okay.
We started out in my living room back then, and now we are online, so anybody anywhere can come to meet us.
Okay, excellent. I would have joined a long time ago if I knew. I was out walking a dog yesterday, and I saw the poster on a pole for this event, and I said, wow, that's great that people are still talking about this and questioning it. I want to just say I really appreciate everyone for showing up. I wish there were more young people here. My perception is that young people today kind of live in their own little world with their headphones on or their whatever and consuming whatever they want to consume. And it's kind of sad to see that they don't really seem to care that much. Hopefully that will change. I feel like we need more of a cultural shift to help that. And I'm really glad to hear that there's some classes being taught at universities that include a development of wider understanding or awareness for the way the world works, basically.
Hands, how many people under 40 here? Find each other before you walk out the door tonight. And,
Raise your hand.
So I really appreciate everyone coming. This is great. My name is Casey Geist.
Thanks, Casey.
And also, I'm really sorry that we've lost Graham. He was an amazing human being, and we should feel very honored that he was really successful in his mission and was so meticulous with his research and seeking and spreading the truth. I'm really glad that he has done so much great work and shared it with us, and thank you for making the documentary. Excellent.
Thank you very much. It's a great, I'm glad the 9/11 Truth Hour is still happening. The one question I always had about the 9/11 situation is the Air Force. We spent trillions and trillions of dollars before 9/11 to protect the United States from attack. And I think, now this is a long time ago, that there was only a couple of airplanes that took off at Otis Air Force Base in the Cape, while those planes were flying around for well over an hour being hijacked. And there was absolutely no military aircraft in the area to, I guess, shoot them down or whatever it is to protect the United States. But I don't hear anything about that part of the 9/11. Another thing about it too is the admiral at Pearl Harbor was court-martialed, or he was demoted, and because of this sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. But there was absolutely no military heads rolling because of this event. I was wondering if there's any.
Yes, there's a book called Day of Deceit, which excellently and thoroughly, amazing documentations by a retired naval officer. He explains the 18-month plan that was executed to goad the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor. And at the beginning, the Japanese codes had already been broken. The U.S. knew everything the Japanese were doing. They made sure that there was no aircraft or ships in the path of the advancing
fleet on Pearl Harbor, and they made sure that the commanding officers at Pearl Harbor knew nothing about the impending attack. That was how Pearl Harbor was done. The airplanes, as soon as the Bush administration entered office, it was decided that air defense launches, that when you send the planes up to intercept something, and that authority was transferred away from the Pentagon to Dick Cheney, and so Dick Cheney arranged to have drills about airplanes flying into buildings happening in northern New England at the same time that the attack was going on against the buildings, which confused defense forces and civilian air traffic control forces, deliberately confused them. You know, oh, this is just a drill, because we know the Air Force is doing a drill about planes flying into a building. But at any rate, the reason why the planes weren't called up was because Dick Cheney was in charge of whether the planes were going to get called up and where they were going to be sent and when. So that's the answer to that. Any other responses to that?
Yeah.
Well, I can't say that I know a lot about the air defense failures. It's one area that I have not studied in depth. I just want to suggest to you and to everybody also that I think, and this is a direction that my organization is moving in, which is to really delve into and demonstrate what I think is a very simple thing to demonstrate, which is that the alleged hijackers could not possibly have commandeered and piloted the aircraft. And I think in a certain way that is such a simple idea that can actually be proven empirically, which is a project that we're working on right now. But I have always found the air defense failures to be, you know, there's all these shifting stories. You know, the lack of access to data, you know, is something that's hard to deal with. Whereas with the building demolitions, we have a tremendous amount of data. But the inability of the alleged hijackers to pilot the aircraft is incredibly obvious, and I think something that the 9/11 research community hasn't focused enough on yet. And I think that it's something that could resonate with the public, in my view. So.
Tell them what. Yeah.
Well, it leads to, I mean, ultimately it leads to the fact that these planes probably were not hijacked by people. They probably were not flown by people. You know, they were flown by uninterruptible autopilot, you know, remote guidance technology. It also opens the question of whether the aircraft that struck the buildings were the aircraft that took off with the passengers, which is, in the long term, something that my organization is interested in studying. But I think this first the starting point is to demonstrate that the hijackers, and probably no pilots, could have flown the flight profiles that were reported on 9/11. So,
I would just say this: no one ever gets punished. In reply to your question about the defense officials, the ones at Otis and at Westfield Air Base off the Turnpike in Westfield and so forth, no one ever gets punished. Sometimes, once in a while, a little lower down person gets punished, but not the people behind it. And as Richard said, Cheney was instrumental in all of these war games going on, including one in New York City on the day of 9/11. And as for this kind of mental thing where people have a hard time dealing with what Dave said, this evil, the killing of President Kennedy, the killing of these other anti-war leaders, and we notice they're all anti-war, that's why they're killed. And then we go to war. I just lost my train of thought. Where did it go? Who took it? It's gone.
I'd just like to make a comment from the JFK research, and that is that one of the problems in the JFK research community was the unending search for details, more and more details, when in fact the conspiracy and the nature of the conspiracy had already been proven. As far as I'm concerned, this film tonight proves without a shadow of a doubt that this was a U.S. government operation. We don't need to do more research. You've demonstrated it, and Graham demonstrated it. And the part of the film where you're quoting American officials talking about anthrax attacks after it had been shown that the anthrax was already from U.S. labs, the mendacity involved there, how much, I mean, what else needs to be proven as far as I'm concerned on this whole thing? So I just caution the 9/11 movement over the problem that one of the ways that this Kennedy assassination is covered up is to insist that there's a mystery that needs to be solved. You need more information. We need more records. We need release of things. I think the same thing can happen with the 9/11 movement, and I just want to caution about that.
I totally hear where you're coming from, and that is really the theme of the JFK article is the false mystery, the idea that there's this thing that's really hard to explain when actually it's not, and all you have to do is look at the behavior of the government, and is the government acting in an honest way. The one thing I will say and is I'm interested in researching the things that I think are actually very obvious that just haven't been quite developed enough yet. So that's why I really personally am interested in the hijackers, the alleged hijackers, not being able to pilot the aircraft. I really think that's something that can resonate with the public, and it's a bit of a failure of the research community so far to have not actually made that case loud enough.
Got a question here. It's patiently waiting.
All right. Thank you. Is this thing on? Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I want to say I have a question, and this was an incredible response because the question about how to tell the story is extremely important. You bring up one topic and suddenly you've lost your audience because they cannot go there. And I'm sure this has happened many times to many of us over the last 20 years. The point that you're making, Ted, about the planes is excellent. Really, really good. And this goes back, Marty, to JFK. As we know, in 1962, he pushed back his advisors about Operation Northwoods. That's almost exactly what we're suggesting happened here, is what was posed 40 years before 9/11. And I'm going to say one more thing, and then my question is for you, Ted. We have to remember that we're all ambassadors here, and what we share is extremely important. And what I find that happens a lot is that it only takes one of us to misquote the science, say something that's off, and suddenly we are now the reason why many people don't believe the entire movement. And these people get cited all the time. So it's really worthwhile to really do the research and be careful with what you share. So my question to you, Ted, and great job with the film, is was there anything else that Graham talked about that you could not include in the film because of constraints, or that you wished he talked about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the interview was about 4.5 hours of footage, of like straight footage between all the breaks and stuff. So, we had to cut out about 2/3 to 3/4 of what he said, maybe even more, because obviously in the film he's not talking the whole time. There's a lot of space. So it was about there was very little. I'm really scratching my head to think if there's something that we were like, we can't put that in. That's he's off the mark, or there's something that I personally disagree with. It was really more a matter of distilling what he was trying to say and picking the things that would be the most salient and that would be the most cohesive. He's written there were many papers. He has done some research into the the attacks in Canada. I think there were two alleged terrorist attacks that took place in the mid-2010s. I wanted to, I asked him about those, wanted to include it. There ended up not being time for that. So I would say that was a decision. He did really good analysis. For all the his research about war and peace, and for his eyewitness account analysis. He also did do a lot of really good scientific analysis, hard math and so on. Some of that shows up with the missing jolt analysis, the lack of deceleration. There was other analysis like that was not didn't make it in the film. The ground shaking before the South Tower really started to come down, which comes from the eyewitness accounts. Is there anything that I was like, that can't be in there? I don't know if that's answering your question. Like, if you're looking for something that I thought wasn't appropriate.
No, looking for something that you wish you could have included, but you couldn't.
Oh, yeah, I mean, definitely that South Tower analysis and his work on the Canadian false flags, and just go ahead and call them that. I mean, there was a ton. I would have loved for it to be like a 2.5, 3 hour film if I thought anybody would actually stick around and watch that much. So, I wish I had a more detailed answer. I'll think about it though, Madhava. Yeah.
You were talking about the hijackers, and that reminded me that I have heard a number of people say, I think John Judge for one, that 9 of the hijackers were later identified alive. They said, that's my picture, but here I am. So there's a lot about that isn't the way it seems, as we expect. But then I had a question about the film and your approach to it. What was your idea in having Graham standing in an empty theater?
Yeah, that's a good question. In a sense, the open seats were, in a way, to me, representing the people that he was speaking to, particularly young people. He spent most of his life, in university lecturing young people or teaching young people. So it was sort of an idea that he's teaching an audience of people. And beyond that, it's just something that's hard to explain, something sort of ephemeral, and that it felt right. And I love that when the film ends, that there's kind of a reflection of the open audience that's facing the audience watching the film, which is one good reason to watch it. As Marty said, to watch this in the movie theater. So that's about it. It just felt right, and it got across the idea of him. Not only teaching young people, but this was actually, and this was a concept that I play with a lot, was that this was his final lecture, basically. So.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. I was a Marine officer, and I spent a lot of time on Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, and because the food was good, but I got to know a lot of fighter pilots, and there was always 5 fighter planes on hair trigger to take off. They had 2 minutes to be rolling down the runway after they received a warning. They had a full ground crew for each plane, and that's the way they do it to protect Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. So we have hundreds of these F-16s and F-15s, and that's their main purpose on a day-to-day basis, is to guard wherever they are. And so sending several of those planes out over the ocean, which they did, is obviously just an intentional screw up, because it was always there, the protection. And Bob Bowman said the same thing in several of his films. Thanks.
And I'm just going to say, so we probably have about 10 more minutes, but please encourage people to speak up, and let's make use of the last 10 minutes.
My train came back. I saw it come in, and it was what I was trying to say before, and the fellow over here who spoke, and Ted said the same thing, and it's about storytelling, and it connects to how to reach young people. I think a major key to all of this that we're talking about is telling a good story and not hammering people over the head with fact after fact after fact after fact. The facts have to fit in, but you have to tell it well. And you have to, as Ted did in this film, I mean, you can't come away from this film without being very emotionally affected. It's just powerful. It's powerful. And this mental block that people have. I grew up in New York City. You know, my nephew was the guy who took all the pictures from the helicopter above the World Trade Towers. He's an anti-terrorism detective. And I asked him last year, I said, Dave, what have you thought about 9/11, you know, since the day? And he said, Ed, I'll tell you this, I haven't thought about it one bit. And my son-in-law worked on the 100th floor of the South Tower. He's an actor, but he was working in a part-time job, and he had worked in this company for a year, and he never took a day off. He was on vacation at our house here in Massachusetts with my daughter, his wife, on the day of 9/11, and 230 or so people in his firm were killed in the company he was working for. And I said to him, I said, Keith, I asked them both this last year, what have you thought about 9/11 since, you know, you almost died? And he said, I haven't thought about it at all. There's this kind of block that, you know, we have to break through that block, and maybe we can do it with creative storytelling, creative filmmakers, like the guy sitting here to my right.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up by one thing. I would like this film to be shown to the firefighters, because the firefighters are talking about never again and honoring, but they don't really take a position on what happened, is in my experience. And I think this film could possibly confront people with going further. And I think that the firefighters are an extremely important group. Well, let me just say a couple things. First of all, there's no question that the government will infiltrate the firefighters' movement and try to prevent it from coming to any serious conclusion about the government's involvement. But that doesn't mean that certain firefighters will be willing to go further into the real truth. And the public has enormous trust in firefighters in general. So I consider them to be an extremely important resource, and your film might be able to attract some elements within that group to go farther.
Thank you, and I just want to point out that the Boston 9/11 Truth Group is quite involved with a group called the Protecting All Protectors Alliance, PAPA. So they're trying to do that work, and want to honor that. And if you're curious about it, feel free to ask them. I've spent a fair amount of time reaching out to firefighters, FDNY, the members of the FDNY whose oral histories are available on the New York Times website. I've interviewed a few of them. It's very, these in general, I would say these people are like the most traumatized, the most, and I've had many cold calls to many of the people in the FDNY oral histories who, you know, who said, I don't believe that anymore, you know, sort of been propagandized. You know, I don't believe what I thought I witnessed on 9/11. I was wrong, kind of a thing. So it's really hard to penetrate, but it really, it might take sort of, that approach might require sort of a grassroots, you've got to find, and I appreciate all the efforts of firefighters sort of around the country, of Chris Joya in Long Island, but if there's somehow a nucleus can be built of people in the FDNY or former FDNY that is led by them, you know, that's sort of the only way to truly mobilize that group. And most of them are almost all of them are out of the FDNY now. We're mostly talking about retired and many dead firefighters, but there's still a community there between the current FDNY and the retired to some extent. So.
Papa has videos directly targeted to the firefighting community. If anybody's interested in getting involved in that arena, check out their website.
There's a question here, Chris.
Good. Well, I just want to say thanks for the film because it's so important. And thank you for doing it. And thanks to Marty Schotz for being so persistent about getting JFK's speech out, that we drink the same water and breathe the same air and care about our children, and we shouldn't be in war all the time. And Ed, I've read some of your essays along the line, and I've always been impressed with them, but I haven't been able to find you online. That's my failing, is it?
You could find my stuff at edwardcurtin.com. It's all there.
And Ed, I agree with everything you say. Oh, okay.
Are you Pat, by the way? Are you Patricia?
Yes.
Okay, great. Nice to meet you.
And thanks.
Yeah.
It's Ted who let me know about this event.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ed, why don't you mention your book, your latest?
My last, yeah.
David
Oh, sorry. The last book I did, I'm doing another one right now, is called Seeking Truth in a Country of Lies.
Oh, I have found that title. I'll get the book. Good.
It's on many of these topics.
Wonderful.
Many of these things.
How do you spell Curtin?
Curtin.
Ted, I want to say that was an absolutely fantastic film.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I really wasn't expecting that, so it was really wonderful. I think that, we're hitting a lot of leaves of the tree instead of the root itself. I think one thing that we really kind of take a look at is that, we have a democracy, but we were founded on a republic. And the difference between a republic and a democracy is republic comes from the ground up, and a democracy is down. And that happened basically, the change happened in 1871 with the Organic Act of 1871, when the United States was bankrupt and a corporation came in and ran all of 18 various offices, post office, coroner's office, military. So the military is no longer under the control of the people. It's under the control of this corporation. So the Organic Act of 1871, and then we can go back to a republic if 13 people per county get together and meet what's called an assembly, because we were a republic before, and that's all it has to done. That's the only thing that has to be done is 13 people per county, per state have to get together, and then that state becomes what's called a du jour state, which means it goes back to the republic. And if there's 38 of them, then we can tell the corporation called the United States of America that we don't need their services anymore, we don't want the war anymore, we don't want anything anymore. So it's that simple. So it goes back to us become a republic again. And it's really fascinating. So it's called the Assembly, and it's a very peaceful revolution that we can take back our own country from the corporation that is running the military, because, the corporation is in the universities, it's in the media, it's in government, it's in everywhere, it's in the United Nations. The United Nations wants to ID everybody, just like, there's no freedom here. So the only way to get it back is to try to form a republic again. And in the Constitution, it says all we need is 13 people per county to physically meet once a month. That's it. And then that state becomes a du jour. There's 2 du jour states right now, Alaska and Michigan. And Michigan is recognized by a handful of countries. So, Ted, absolutely fantastic movie. It was the best.
Thank you, Tony. And I'm interested to hear more about this idea. So, does anybody else want to speak to that? No? Okay. We probably have a couple more minutes. Does any last questions? Actually, we have maybe 1 minute. Maybe it's time to wrap up now. If anybody'd like to go out for a snack or a quick drink, I'll be hanging out front for a little bit, and we can maybe leave in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so on. Thank you to everyone who came out. Richard, it was great to see all your faces, great to talk to all of you. Thank you so much for watching the film and for enjoying it. And yeah. Richard, would you like to say any last words?
I wanted to also thank all of you for the discussion. It was a good discussion. It was a somewhat inspiring discussion. It pointed us some directions that we might think about expanding our message in. And I would say in these desert days, this was an up.